If you haven't noticed, I can be verbose. I can go into a 3-day seminar about a single topic and provide you valuable resources that you can use and benefit from. But that's not always appropriate. Hi, I'm Justin Hitt with Inside Strategic Relations. If you want to influence action and get better results, very often less is more. I'd like to share with you some feedback I got from one of my peers and mentors about how to approach meetings, how to approach interactions with individuals. Now, if someone asks me a question, I take great pride in giving them the very best answer I can deliver. If you ask a question about how can I be more effective in conversations with business people and those who are busy so that they accomplish more of what I ask them or they actually implement what we're presenting, then I could share with you 3 days or 3 hours or 3 minutes depending on what your need is. The challenge I often have is knowing whether 3 minutes, 3 hours, or 3 days is required. And the tip I got was to provide that next step in detail. Now, I already kind of know this from selling. You want to help your customer take that next step towards the outcome they desire. And if you give them the next 5 steps, they're usually not going to do anything. They're a bit overwhelmed. But if you give them just the next step, they're more likely to move forward. So I'm going to share some tips around that to get you started, because influence is measured by the activities of other individuals. So if you are in a meeting and you're the subject matter expert and someone says, "What advice do you have about X, Y, and Z?" It doesn't serve the other person to give them advice about X, Y, and Z. You need to first determine which of the 3 outcomes or the 3 topics is most relevant or important. You may also ask a question to determine what specific outcomes are they seeking to achieve and what topics are of immediate value. So you're almost developing a critical path before you answer the question. These podcasts are about 15 minutes. Before I sit down and do a podcast, I think about what is the topic, what is the outcome and benefit that you're going to receive as the listener, and what are 2 or 3 key points that I can deliver to drive home that topic so that you actually get some kind of result. If I was sharing with you the power of influence and I gave you a massive 30-hour presentation rather than 15-minute chunks, you might not want to get started listening to that 30 hours because that implies a commitment of time and resources, where you might take just 15 minutes to listen to this while you're exercising or working around the office or cleaning up around the house, because it really is in parallel with what you're already doing. So that's the next piece of advice. Offer advice that moves forward on the momentum the individual already has. So if somebody's asking you how to increase sales, for example, you want to find out what ways are already working to increase sales. They give you a few ways that already work. You ask them about what kind of obstacles keep you from producing sales. You might ask another question about what do we mean by increased sales? Do you want $1 million increase or do you want a $100,000 increase? What is the scale of the increase? Then you can provide an appropriate suggestion relevant to their forward momentum. So we're building on what already works. It has the appropriate scale, so you have a test to see whether it's $1 million idea or a $100,000 idea. And then finally, you're working within the resources they already have. Because I don't know how many times you've had this, but somebody asks for advice, you share the advice based on this concept, and they say, "You know what, I've already tried that before." Well, if you ask them previously, what things have you tried in the past that didn't work, then you know not to provide that advice because they're already convinced it doesn't work. If you ask them what's working well today and they give you 3 or 4 things that work well today and you're building on those things to make them work better, they already have a confidence that those are contributing factors and those can go forward. Sometimes it isn't the thing that the person should do as much as either the frequency they should do it or the structure or process in which they should do it in. So an example, and I know I'm using a lot of sales examples here, but a lot of salespeople do telemarketing. And the mere fact of hiring out telemarketers to pre-screen calls before connecting with the salesperson, that can boost productivity. So it's the same activity, it's just done a different way. That is how you can take someone to the next level. Now, if they need additional information beyond the what and the why, then you can do that at another time. So in this 15-minute presentation, very often you hear me say, hey, I cover that in another program. Here's the name of the program. Or if you're interested in business process, then ask me about business process. Right now, we're focusing on how to get someone else to take the next step. You are essentially setting up a reason for them to come back and ask for more information. When they come back and ask for more information, you're increasing the value of that relationship because they now see you as someone who can provide additional information. You're improving your positioning, but you're not cluttering up the immediate conversation with miscellaneous minutia or details that may tangent their efforts from getting the results that they're looking for. And speaking of results that they're looking for, having a clear picture of their desired outcome helps you bridge that momentum. So they're stumbling and they're asking you for questions to try to move forward again. You give them the next thing to move forward, but they need to have that vision of where they're going moving forward. Because legitimately, between any point A and B on a line, there could be an infinite number of steps. You're simply giving them the high-level steps that are along a critical path and then focusing on the very next thing that they should do. Once they take that action, they will likely see a result or benefit, which you could preview that in advance. You could say, hey, if you do this, you're going to get this. And then when they see that they got what you said they would get, they're now more likely to ask for additional information. You can imply that there are additional steps that we can discuss at a later date, but ultimately you're setting them up for success. If I can give you just one thing in a 15-minute podcast, you're more likely to listen to the next podcast. You're more likely to raise your hand when you have specific questions. The key is we are cultivating that relationship both with communications, which we have this what's called a chain of communications. It's an ask and response cycle where you're building a connection through the language used, but we also have an action chain that is that next step that they're going to take and move forward, next step and move forward. Now, if you're working with subordinate employees, that next step might have a report. Go do this and then report. Here's the overall process. Go do this next step and report. If they ask questions about the overall, no, you got to make your first dollar before you make your $10,000. The chain of actions might build out with a structure, but it also might build out with them taking exploratory steps. Hey, what do I do in this situation? Here's an example of I'm keeping fish. What kind of fish should I keep? Well, why do you want to keep fish? What's the purpose of the fish? Have you ever had fish before? Do you have any experience with aquariums? You find that point of establishment, that first start. And then their next step might be visiting an aquarium store. It might be drawing out on paper the ideas they have about fish. They could go saltwater fish or freshwater fish. They could go saltwater fish for coral and ornamental fish, or they could go freshwater fish for entertainment or freshwater fish for aquaculture. There's this giant decision tree. Your objective is to simply get them to the next node in the tree where they can kind of get a little more information to make better decisions, take specific actions to discover their position, and then ultimately move forward within a framework that is kind of laid out for them. So that framework is the big picture, and it could have criteria for implementation, and then ultimately you're just walking them down step at a time. Now, you might be asking, Justin, this sounds like a lot of work. Doesn't this put the onus on me to do the thinking for the other person? And it kind of does. It is, you're leading them down a path step by step. So you will have to consider scale. So you can't have every person you take them to the next step. but you can take them up to the door where they go in the room, and then they can take care of themselves when they're in the room. Think about it this way, and this is kind of an odd example, is if somebody's got to use the bathroom. You don't have to tell them how to use the bathroom, but you might need to show them where the bathroom is. So you're essentially trying to understand what the need is, trying to understand what the outcome desired is, and then taking them up to the door. And then after that point, you may or may not have to do anything. You may just have to remember they're there so you don't leave the restaurant without them. But ultimately, it's just that next step of compliance. So when they take that step and they get the results that they were looking for, they're more likely to come back to you to go for the next step. So there really isn't a monitoring requirement. I do keep callback logs, and I recommend a callback log if there's any additional action on your part. You might also have a tickler file to follow up on people. So for clients, for example, but ultimately, because you've laid out a high level framework and you've taken them on the next step, they are going to be on that way for the journey. And you can do that for thousands of people. You can do that for 10 people. You can do that for 100 people. The key is that you've moved them forward towards what they want. And ultimately that gets you what you want. The last point I want to share is that you might be able to say 3 days about a topic, but don't say 3 days about a topic until you know exactly what that audience wants. So a one-to-one conversation is likely going to be a 3-minute conversation. A one-to-many, so a room full of people, might be a 3-day conversation. This really fits into the intellectual property model that we talk about as far as positioning yourself in a marketplace as an expert. But you've got to know in your day-to-day conversations whether this needs to be a 3-minute, a 30-minute, a 90-minute. You need to know. And if it's helpful, you might even keep a little timer on your desk to know that you might use 3 minutes for exploratory, 3 minutes for answers, and then 3-minute call to action, so that you've got a more structure to what you're doing so that you don't trail off. I have the challenge that if I'm on the phone with a client and it's a 15-minute consultation, I literally have a timer, because I could turn that 15 minutes into 30 minutes into an hour, because I'm interested in the topic. You like it when people ask you questions, especially about things that you have an answer. You don't want to give anybody if you don't know the answer, you don't want to give anybody a quick termination. That means if somebody asks you, like my kid was asking me about the Voyager satellites and the time displacement between those Voyager satellites and the current time here on Earth, and I had no idea the answer. So I instead of just cutting it off because he's interested in the topic, I did ask him more context. And then at the end, I said, well, I don't know the answer, but here are 3 sources that might be able to tell you the answer. And then he was able to go get the answer. And it turns out there's a time dilation between the satellites way out there in space and the times here on Earth. And it's very interesting and complex. But now I know. And I know it through my child, who was able to go and take that next step to get an answer. I have no idea if that answer is going to be useful for him for homework or anything like that. But if I would have immediately answered the question, it would not have delivered any value. If I would immediately have said, I don't know the answer, go look it up, that would not have provided that context and value for him to go actually find an answer. So taking a few minutes, just ask some questions, determine the context, determine the desired outcome or scale the individual wants, and then offering a valuable question or valuable response allows you to deliver value even if you don't know the answer. So let me summarize here. First off, it's very easy to be verbose when you know a topic. In my head, there are volumes of things that I would love to share with you, and I need to share it within the construct of a consultation. Otherwise, I might talk your head off, and I don't want to do that because it would not be respectful of your time. If you want to gain influence over other people, influence is measured by action. So if you're going to ask somebody to do something and they don't do it, you've had zero influence. So while building your credibility is important and becoming a subject matter expert, becoming a recognized expert helps, if the other person doesn't take action because they think it's too difficult or it's too many steps or they're just not clear on whether that action is going to benefit them, then you haven't produced any influence. You need to deliver to them a dialogue which helps you better understand where they're going or what result they want, and then deliver the most appropriate advice to just take them on the next step. This will allow them to get some results and reinforces the value of the relationship that you have with them. And finally, if you do find yourself verbose and you do find yourself wanting to expand on a topic, use platforms like podcasts, special reports, interviews, or conversations with peers that are recorded so that you have this intellectual property that we'll talk about in other programs about how you can use that for positioning and how you can use it to build up your portfolio of profits. But it's a way of getting it out of your system, because if you get excited and you want to tell people about something and share it, but telling isn't helping them. Telling isn't taking them to the next level. And in order to gain that influence, in order to build that prosperity that comes with having a command and control position or becoming a master of the universe, you need to have the other people take action. It is no good for them to ask you a question or to get advice or instruction from you and then not being able or not be ready to take that action. Because again, influence is measured by the action of other people. I'm Justin Hitt with Inside Strategic Relations, where we help high-income professionals and entrepreneurs gain greater influence and persuasion in their marketplace so that they can transform business relationships into profits guaranteed. If you have any questions about this or any other program that we share, be sure to visit us at www.insidestrategicrelations.com. Either open a support ticket or contact us. I'm always interested in hearing from you. I'm always interested in your success stories and your questions, and I look forward to hearing from you before the next podcast. Thanks for listening. Again, I'm Justin Hitt with Inside Strategic Relations.